In 1919, Japan developed its first 24-inch torpedo. To be clear, this was not the oxygen-powered Type 93 Long Lance, which entered service nearly a decade and a half later. The result at the time, though, was that the last three Kumas were canceled, and a new class that was near a repeat was started. These were the 6 ships of the 5,088-ton Nagara class that started entering service in April of 1922. There were only a couple real differences. First, the larger torpedoes meant they were slightly wider, which also improved stability. Second, they had a flying-off platform over guns 1 and 2 with an aircraft hangar built into the superstructure. This was a result of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in which the British shared technology, designs, and tactics with the Japanese. The first 3 were funded in 1919, and the second 3 a year later. The last ship, Abukuma, was completed after the previous ones due to the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Nagara was started September 9, 1920, and completed April 21, 1922. Isuzu was started August 10, 1920, and completed August 15, 1923. Natori was started December 20, 1920, and completed September 15, 1922. Yora was started May 21, 1921, and completed March 20, 1923. Kinu was started January 17, 1921, and completed November 22, 1922. Abukuma was started December 8, 1921, and completed May 26, 1925. Main armament was again 7 140mm 50 caliber guns of the same type and in the same layout as the Kumas, again with a maximum elevation of 35 degrees. 2 were forward of the bridge, 1 facing forward and number 2 facing aft. 2 more sat on either side of the bridge. Guns 5 and 6 sat well aft on the center line, just ahead of the rear superstructure. This effectively restricted their firing arcs to off the beams. Mount 7 was fitted centerline just aft of the rear superstructure. Secondary armament was 2 single 76mm 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns, 1 on either side of the first funnel. Torpedo armament was 8 24-inch torpedoes in 4 twin mountings, in the same layout as the Kuma's 21-inch tubes. 2 mounts of 2 on each side. 1 pair was mounted in low cutouts between the bridge and the forward funnel. The rear pair were in cubbyholes aside and in front of gun 5. These were the then new Type 82 24-inch torpedo, which entered service in 1920. Weight was 2,362 kilograms and length was 8.4 meters. They used a kerosene and air-burning 4-cylinder radial engine instead of a turbine. Warhead weight was 346 kilograms. Range was 10,000 meters at 38 knots, or 15,000 meters at 32 knots, or 20,000 meters at 27 knots. Again, like the Kumas, 48 mines could be carried. Propulsion was a repeat of the Kumas, 12 boilers in 4 rooms. The first 2 rooms vented to 1 funnel, while the other 2 each had their own. The first room had 2 small coal-burning boilers. The second had 4 medium oil burners. The third had 4 large oil burners, and the fourth had 2 small oil burners. These provided steam to the 4 turbines, 2 per room, which produced 90,000 horsepower for a speed of 36 knots. They had 1 rudder. Protection was 63 millimeters of belt armor that protected the engines. Deck armor was 29 millimeters, increasing to 45 millimeters over the magazines. Conning tower armor was up to 51 millimeters on the sides and 25 millimeters on the roof. 1 aircraft could be carried in the tower, then fly off the platform over the forward guns. Modifications varied depending on the ship, especially once the war started. For the most part, light and medium anti-aircraft was constantly updated whenever possible and wherever possible. Big changes, though, could mostly only be done as they came in for repairs or overhaul. Yura in 1929, and then in 1931 Kinu replaced their flying-off platforms with catapults. Between 1932 and 1934, Natori, Nagara, Isuzu, and Abukuma had their flying-off platforms removed, and a catapult for float planes was added between guns 6 and 7. In the mid-30s to late 30s, they all went through a general modernization. The bridge was modified. The coal-fired boilers were converted to oil burning. The 76mm anti-aircraft guns were replaced with more medium anti-aircraft. As a result of the Tomozuru and 4th Fleet incidents, all received permanent ballast. The extra weight meant displacement rose to 5,800 tons and speed fell to about 32 knots. In 1941, Abukuma had all 4 twin Type 82 24-inch torpedo mounts removed, with 2 quadruple mounts, one on each side, for the Type 93 long lance replacing the rear ones. In December of 1942, Abukuma had her No. 5 gun removed. In January of 1943, Nagara had her No. 5 gun removed. Also in January through May of 1943, Isuzu had guns 5 and 7 removed. A twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft gun replaced gun 7, and Type 21 radar was fitted. Also in May of 1943, Abukuma had Type 21 radar added. In August of 1943, Nagara was fitted with the Type 21 radar. In August through mid-October of 1943, Kinu had guns 5 and 7, along with her catapult and float plane removed. A twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft gun replaced gun 7. Depth charge racks and Type 21 radar were also fitted. A month later, in October of 1943, Abukuma replaced her 7th gun with a 5-inch 40 caliber twin mount. In January through April of 1944, Nagara traded her No. 7 gun for a twin 5-inch 40 caliber, had her catapult and float plane removed, and traded the 4 twin Type 82 torpedo mounts for 2 quadruple, one on each side, Type 93 long lance mounts where the rear twins had been. Depth charge rails and Type 93 sonar were also added. While undergoing repairs from June of 1943 to June of 1944, Natori had guns 5 and 7 along with her catapult and float plane removed. A twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft gun replaced gun 7, and Type 21 radar along with Type 93 sonar was fitted. In March of 1944, Abukuma had her catapult and float plane removed. In late June of 1944, Nagara was fitted with the Type 22 radar. Also in July, Abukuma got the Type 22 radar. While being repaired in May through September of 1944, Isuzu was converted into an anti-aircraft light cruiser. The 5 remaining 140mm mounts were removed along with the 4 Type 82 twin torpedo tubes and the catapult. 2 more twin 5-inch 40 caliber mounts were added, 1 mount where gun 1 had been, and 1 mount right behind the funnels. 2 quadruple Type 93 long lance launchers replaced the rear torpedo mounts. 2 racks for 36 depth charges were added to the stern. Type 13 and 22 radars along with Type 93 sonar were also added. Finally, in August through October of 1944, Kinu was fitted with the Type 13 and 22 radars. Nagara spent December of 1941 supporting the invasion of the southern Philippines. She then spent the first 3 months of 1942 supporting the invasion of the East Indies. This included the invasion of Celebes in January and the first half of February, Bali in the second half of February, and Christmas Island in March. After a refit, in early June she took part in the Battle of Midway, Admiral Nagumo transferring his flag to her after the bombing of Akagi. In late August, she sailed from Japan and escorted the carriers during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In late October, she again covered the carriers as they fought the Battle of Santa Cruz. On November 13th, she took part in the wild shootout known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Only 2 days later, she returned and took part in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The rest of 1942 and most of 1943 was spent ferrying back and forth around Truk, the Solomons, and Japan. In late November of 1943, she was part of the force that responded to the American invasion of the Gilberts. For her troubles, she was attacked by carrier aircraft and damaged by several near misses that sent her back to Japan for repairs and refit, arriving in late January of 1944. Even when repairs were completed, she stayed in Japanese home waters. At noon 20 on August 7, 1944, she was hit in the starboard quarter by a torpedo from the submarine Croker. 20 minutes later, at 12:40 p.m., she sank stern first. Isuzu started the war by supporting the invasion of Hong Kong. She then spent the first half of 1942 supporting the occupation of the East Indies, before returning to Japan for refit in late June. She then spent July and August back in the Indian Ocean in support of the Burma campaign. In late September, she arrived at Rabaul carrying troops and supplies to reinforce the fight for Guadalcanal. Overnight, on October 13th, she sailed with Haruna and Congo as they shelled Henderson Field, then took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. On the night between the two naval battles of Guadalcanal, she supported the cruisers that bombarded Henderson Field. At 8 a.m. the next morning, while heading north, she was so near missed by two bombs that her No. 3 boiler room was flooded, causing her speed to be cut in half. A month later, in mid-December, she finally arrived back in Japan for repairs. With repairs and upgrades completed, in early May she arrived at Truk in late June carrying supplies. Most of the rest of 1943 was spent ferrying supplies around the South Pacific until early December. While in port at Roe on December 5th, she was attacked by carrier aircraft supporting the Gilberts' invasion. The most serious damage was a near miss on the starboard quarter that knocked out her starboard propellers. Limping on one propeller and leaking water, she finally arrived back at Japan for repairs and conversion to an anti-aircraft light cruiser near the end of January 1944. So bad was the damage, and so overworked were the shipyards, that repairs and conversion weren't completed until mid-September, 9 months later. In late October, she was part of the Northern Decoy Force at the Battle of Cape Engano, receiving only minor damage herself before returning to Japan. In mid-November, she sailed from Japan on a supply run to the East Indies with a stopover at Manila. While departing Manila on November 19th, she was hit at the stern by a torpedo from the submarine Hake that destroyed her rudder. Arriving at Surabaya in mid-December, repairs took until April of 1945. At 6 a.m. on April 7, 1945, while ferrying troops around the East Indies, she was hit northwest of Bimi by a torpedo from the submarine Gabelin on the port side just aside her bridge. The damage was pretty bad. Flooding caused her to trim down by the bow and list to port while knocking her down to 6 knots. 2.5 hours later, at 8:30 a.m., while the crew was trying to contain the flooding, she was hit again on the port by 3 torpedoes from the submarine Char, ripping open her rear turbine room and blowing off her bow. Only a few minutes after that, she rolled over to port and sank. Natori started the war by covering the invasion of Luzon in the Philippines. While doing so on December 10th, she was near missed by a bomb that sent her to Formosa for 2 weeks of repairs. With repairs completed in late December of 1941, she transferred to the East Indies and screened transport as the Japanese overran the region, then remained in the area for the rest of the year. Highlights included taking part in the lopsided Battle of Sunda Strait in the invasion of Christmas Island. At 8:40 a.m., while 18 miles southeast of Ambon on January 9, 1943, she was hit by a torpedo from the submarine Tautog. The hit blew off the stern, including her rudder. In port at Ambon a few weeks later, on January 21st, she was so near missed by a bomb that her center boiler room flooded. Finally returning to Japan in June of 1943, repairs took a year. Finally repaired at the start of June 1944, she ferried reinforcements to the Philippines, then protected the supply ships supporting the main fleet at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Returning to the Philippines at the end of the month, 200 miles east of Samar, while transporting supplies from the East Indies to the Philippines at 2:40 a.m. on August 18, 1944, she was hit portside by a torpedo from the submarine Hardhead, which knocked out her boilers, leaving her dead in the water. An hour later, another of Hardhead's torpedoes hit her on the starboard side. At 7:05 a.m., she finally sank. Yora started the war at sea as the flagship of a submarine squadron supporting the invasion of Malaya. In the middle of the month, she helped cover the invasion of Borneo. In February, she covered the invasion of first southern Sumatra and then western Java. In early March, she covered the invasion of northern Sumatra, then ended the month covering the invasion of the Andaman Islands. In early April, she sailed from the Andaman Islands and took part in the northern Indian Ocean raid before returning to Japan near the end of the month. At the Battle of Midway in early June of 1942, she covered the invasion force, so didn't take much part in the actual battle before returning to Japan. On August 24th, she took part in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. 2 months later, on October 25th at 1 p.m., she was heading south on a mission to bombard Henderson Field that was supposed to coincide with the Battle of Santa Cruz, when she was attacked by aircraft from the island. 2 bombs hit her forward engine room and caused flooding aft that resulted in her trimming down by the stern and cutting her speed to 12 knots. Following another attack at 2:15 p.m., she was finally scuttled at 6:30 p.m. Kinu started the war by covering the invasion of Malaya. The rest of the month was spent supporting the invasion of northern Borneo. In late February, she covered the invasion of central Java. In April, she supported the invasion of northern New Guinea, then returned to Japan for an overhaul in the second half of May, then returned to the East Indies, where she stayed till mid-September. In the second half of September, she escorted a troop convoy to the Solomons, then was back in the East Indies by the end of the month. With the exception of a refit at Japan between August and October 1943, there she stayed on garrison duty until mid-April of 1944, when she ran reinforcements to Saipan, then returned at the end of the month. In the second half of August 1944, she ferried supplies to the Philippines, then returned to the East Indies. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Kinu wasn't part of the massive center force, but rather, after towing the damaged Aoba to Manila, was part of a small convoy ferrying troops from Mindoro to Ormoc on the opposite side of Leyte Island from where the Americans had landed. While approaching the island on the morning of October 26th, she was hit several times by planes from the escort carriers supporting the liberation. The worst hit came at about 11:30 a.m. when a bomb destroyed her aft engine room, leaving her dead in the water and settling by the stern. After abandoning ship at 5:30 p.m., she finally went down stern first in only 150 feet of water, where she was dived on by the U.S. in July of 1945, 45 miles southwest of Ormoc. Abu Kuma escorted the carriers of Kido Butai that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, as flagship of the destroyer Screen. She remained with the carriers through the invasion of Rubal, the raid on Darwin, the invasion of the East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raid. In May of 1942, she parted ways with the carriers and joined the Northern Force, supporting the invasion of the Aleutians simultaneous to the Battle of Midway at the start of June. With the exception of the occasional refit, she mostly stayed in northern waters until early August of 1944, before returning to Japan to prepare for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Notable actions during that time included taking part in the March 1943 Battle of Komandorsky and the evacuation of Attu and Kiska. On October 21st, she sailed from Taiwan to take part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. While entering the Surigao Strait, in the pre-dawn hours of October 25th, she was badly damaged by a torpedo from PT-137 that flooded her forward boiler room, knocking her speed down to 20 knots and causing her to trim down by the bow. Following the slaughter of Southern Force at Surigao Strait, which her force had been following, she came about and retreated. The next day, October 26, 1944, between 10 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. near Negros Island, the already damaged cruiser was attacked by bombers that hit her 3 times. One destroyed her forward number 3 gun. More serious was the 2 that hit aft. These destroyed her rear turbine room and her steering gear, leaving her dead in the water. The resulting fires also detonated her port torpedo bank. The end came at 12:45 p.m. when she finally sank stern first.